Chapter 7 of The Silk-Stocking Murders by Anthony Barclay. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Getting to grips with the case. Soon after 8 o'clock that same evening, in response to a telephoned hint from Roger, Chief Inspector Moresby again visited the Albany. Official permission to discard his reticence at last duly obtained. Roger welcomed him with a choice of whiskey or beer, pipe, tobacco, or cigarettes, and they settled down in front of the fire, pipes alight, and a pewter tankard at each elbow, to go into the case with real thoroughness. "By the way, have you seen the Evening Clarion?" Moresby remarked, first of all, pulling the paper in question from his pocket. "You journalists do give us a lot of trouble, you know." He handed it over, marking a certain paragraph with his thumb. The paragraph was at the end of an account of the inquest on Lady Ursula that morning. Roger read, "From the unobtrusive presence among the spectators at the back of the court of a certain highly placed official at Scotland Yard, it may be argued that the police are not altogether satisfied with the case as it stands at present. Certainly, there seem to be many obscure points which require clearing up. It must not be supposed that the said official's interest in the proceedings necessarily means that Scotland Yard definitely suspects foul play, but it is not too much to assume that we have not yet heard the last of this tragic affair." "Very cleverly put," was Roger's professional comment. "Damn the fellow," he added unprofessionally. "It's a nuisance," agreed his companion. "I've put a stop to any more, of course, and I dare say there's no harm done really, but that sort of thing's very annoying when you're doing all you can to keep your inquiries a close secret. Anyhow, there's one blessing. Nobody's brought up the Monte Carlo business yet." "Monte Carlo? What's that?" "Oh, didn't you know about that, Mr. Sheringham?" asked the chief inspector, his eyes twinkling. "I made sure you had that at your fingers' ends. Why, a French girl, a croquette, or whatever they call them over there." "A coquette," Roger corrected without a smile, "described as an actress, yes? Well, a French coquette was found dead in her bedroom in February in just the same way. She'd lost a good deal of money in the casino, so of course they assumed she'd hanged herself. It was more or less hushed up. Those things always are there, and I don't think it was even mentioned in the papers over here. We heard about it unofficially." "Monte Carlo this February, eh?" Roger said thoughtfully. "That ought to be a bit of help." "It's about all we've got to go on," said the chief inspector rather dolefully. "I mean, assuming that this is murder at all, and that the same man's responsible for it. That, I should say, and the note." "The note? Oh, you mean the note Lady Ursula left? Yes, I'd realized, of course, that if it was murder, all those notes must have been written with quite a different meaning than the one everybody gave them later. The murderer's a clever man, Moresby. There's no getting away from it." "He is that, Mr. Sheringham, but there's a bit more to be got out of Lady Ursula's than the others. If it was murder, then that note must have meant something quite different, as you say. But its importance to us is that it was creased. You can see it at the yard any time." "I see," Roger nodded. "And it hadn't been left in an envelope, you mean? In other words, it must have been in another envelope at one time, and therefore was definitely not written on that occasion. Or in somebody's pocket. The paper's a tiny bit rubbed at the creases as if it had been in a pocket. Well, Mr. Sheringham, find the person to whom that note was written, and we've gone a long way towards solving the mystery. It's the only clue we've got, but I shouldn't be surprised if it isn't going to be the only one we shall want. Mark my words, sir, it's that note that's going to clear up this affair for us, if we can only find out who it was written to." "I shouldn't be surprised," Roger replied noncommittally. Privately, however, he did not feel so sure. He recognized that Scotland Yard was going to regard the letter as the dominant clue, but the method of the dominant clue, though often brilliantly successful, or rather not so much brilliantly as painstakingly, was liable to fall to the ground when the clue in question did not come up to scratch. By disregarding the side issues in these latter cases, Scotland Yard had many failures in its records which a less single-aimed method, such as the French with its inductive reasoning, would almost certainly have solved. And it was no palliative to point out that the reverse also was equally true, and that there are unsolved mysteries in the French annals which the more laborious method of Scotland Yard would probably have cleared up. A really rogue-proof detective service, Roger had long ago decided, should not stick to one method at all, but make use of them all, and he determined that the partnership between himself and Moresby should be such a service in miniature. Let Moresby pursue the dominant clue and call on the organized resources of Scotland Yard to help him do so. He himself would look at the problem as a whole, from every possible side, and do his best to combine the amazing deductive powers of the Austrian criminological professors with the imaginative brilliance of the star French detectives. It is characteristic of Roger that he took this tremendous task on his shoulders with complete composure between two pulls at his tankard. The two settled down into a steady talk. During the next half hour, Roger found himself much impressed with the common-sense level-headedness of his colleague, whom he had been inclined to regard, in consequence of his preference for a dominant clue, as lacking in perception of the finesses of scientific criminology. He was also a little chagrined to find that Moresby's knowledge of criminal history was even more complete than his own. As the discussion progressed, Roger was not the only one to make discoveries. The chief inspector, too, hitherto disposed to regard Roger as a volatile-witted amateur intent only on proving impossible theories of his own erection, now found himself considerably more impressed than he had anticipated by his companion's quick grasp of essentials and the vivid imagination he was able to bring to bear on the problem. If he had felt any misgivings about taking a leaf out of the storybooks and admitting an amateur into his counsels, they were not long in disappearing. By the end of half an hour, the partnership was on a firm basis. As if to mark the fact, Roger rose and replenished the tankards. The beer, it may be remarked, was a good sound 4X, of a dark fruity color, from a cask in the next room, Roger's study. Oh, all you young women, distrust a man who does not drink good sound fruity 4X with zest, as you would one of your own sex who did not care to powder her nose. Now, it seems to me, said Roger, as he sat down again, that we have been talking too much at random. Let's take things under their proper heads, one at a time. First of all, the deaths themselves. We've agreed that any other hypothesis but that of murder is putting too great a strain on coincidence, haven't we? Well then, let's take a leaf out of the French notebook and reconstruct the crime. Very well, Mr. Sheringham, sir. I'd like to hear you do that. Well, this is how I see it. The murderer first of all selected his victim with a good deal of care. She must fulfill certain conditions. For instance, she must above all be so far familiar with his appearance, at any rate, as to feel no alarm on seeing him. Then the opportunity would be chosen with equal cunning. It must be when she is alone and likely to remain so for at least half an hour. But all that's quite elementary. There's never any harm in running over the elementary parts with the rest, said the chief inspector, gazing into the fire. Well, having got the girl and the opportunity together, he proceeds to overpower her. I say that because no girl is going to submit tamely to being hanged, still less is she going to take off one of her stockings and offer it for the purpose. And yet none of them show any obvious evidence of a struggle. Even the marks on Lady Ursula's wrists can't be called that. Well, now, how did he overpower them? That's it, observed Chief Inspector Moresby. He was devilish clever, Roger continued, warming to his work. You try overpowering an ordinary healthy girl and see whether there isn't going to be a deuce of a struggle. Of course there is, so it's an elementary deduction to say that he must be a strong and probably very big man, and they didn't even cry out. Obviously, then, he must have stopped that first. I'm not so childish, by the way, as to suggest chloroform or anything fatuous like that. Anybody but the writers of penny dreadfuls knows that chloroform doesn't act like that, to say nothing of the smell afterwards. No, what I do suggest is a woolen scarf thrown unexpectedly across her mouth from behind and drawn tight in the same instant. How's that? I can't think of anything better, and that's a fact. Well, a strong man could easily knot that at the back of her head, catch her wrists, her hands would be instinctively trying to pull at the stuff over her mouth, and twist them into the small of her back. I admit that it's more of a job to fasten them there, but a knowledge of jujitsu might help. He could put her, in such a position that she couldn't move without breaking an arm. Hold both her wrists there with one hand and tie them together with the other. And, as there are only the faintest bruises there, he would obviously have to fasten them with something that isn't going to cut the skin. One end of the same woolen scarf, for instance. Roger paused and moistened his clay. "Go on, Mr. Sheringham," urged Moresby politely. "Well, then, of course, he'd got her where he wanted her. It wouldn't be difficult after that, I imagine, to remove one of her stockings, and then he could proceed with his preparations at leisure, screwing the hook into the door, arranging a chair to stand her on, and all the rest of it. And after he'd hanged her, all he would have to do is to unfasten the scarf and untie her wrists and ankles." The chief inspector nodded. "That's about what happened, no doubt of it." "Well, there's the reconstruction, and I don't see that it gives us anything fresh, except perhaps the woolen scarf, and that's only a guess. As to the man's psychology, that's obvious enough. He's mad, of course. His only possible motive, so far as one can see, is murder for love of killing. Homicidal mania developed to hopeless insanity. The victim's own stocking, for instance, and I imagine it would have to be silk. Yes, that brain of his must be full of strange twists. The idea of hanging a girl with a lisle thread stocking would probably shock him as much as it would you or me." "It's on Jack the Ripper lines right enough," commented the chief inspector. "That's another heading, criminological parallels. There's Jack the Ripper, as you say, and Neil Cream, though he's rather different psychologically. I never could understand him not wanting to watch his victims die. Could you? I should have imagined that was the whole object of that type of murderer. Can you think of any other similar cases besides those two?" "Sexual murders, Mr. Sheringham, or lust murders, as the psychologists call them? Well, they're not very common in this country, are they? Most of the foreign ones are like Jack the Ripper, too, aren't they? Stabbing, I suppose, taking 'em all round, the best known are Andreas Bickle, Menisclue, Alton, Gruyot, and Verzenzi. Then there was an outbreak of stabbing murders in New York in July 1902, and another in Berlin, funnily enough, the same month. Then there was Wilhelm Damien in Ludwigshafen in Germany in 1901, and—" "Great Scott, Moresby," interrupted the astonished Roger. "You must have been sitting up late since they made you a chief inspector. How on earth do you know all this?" "It's my business, Mr. Sheringham," replied the chief inspector austerely, and drowned his smile in good 4x. "Well, what I meant," Roger continued in somewhat chastened tones, "is, can we learn anything from these parallels?" "I doubt it, sir, except that of all murderers, these are the most difficult to catch, and it won't need any criminological parallels to teach us that, I'm afraid." "Well, let's go on to the next heading. Victims. What do they give us? The Monte Carlo woman. Do you know anything about her?" "Not yet. I've written over for all details, but if it was the same man, we'd get that he must have been in Monte Carlo at the time, of course." "Yes, that may help us a lot. What about getting hold of a list of all English visitors at Monte Carlo last February?" "I've done that, Mr. Sheringham," replied the chief inspector with a tolerant smile. In matters of routine, no amateur could teach him anything. "And in Nice, Cannes, and all the other Riviera places as well." "Good man," said Roger, uncrushed. "Well, then, there's Janet Manners, or Unity Ransom, as I think we better go on calling her. The only thing I can see there is that he must have been known to her, and pretty well, too, for her to have taken him into her sitting room when she was alone in the flat. That is, if I read her rightly, that may be a useful help to us." "That's true enough. Elsie Benham, so far as I see, gives us nothing at all. He might have been known to her, or he might not. In the second alternative, she must have picked him up between the club and her flat off the Tottenham Court Road. In the first, he might have been waiting for her at the flat. The only hope is that the constable on the beat caught sight of them together." "And he didn't," put in the inspector. "I've already ascertained that. But I'm having inquiries made as to anyone else having done so, though I don't think there is much hope. And that leaves Lady Ursula. Well, you know, I can't see that there's much more there. When one comes to think of it, he needn't have known her at all. He could have introduced himself easily enough in the street as a friend of hers. A little thing like that wouldn't have worried Lady Ursula. Or he might have been a friend of the girl who owns the studio, and knocked in passing on seeing a light inside. I can't see that there's much more." "There's the note, Mr. Sheringham," the chief inspector reminded him. "In my opinion, that shows that the thing was premeditated and the note was brought for the purpose." "But how could he have known that she was going to the studio? She never said anything about it to her friends. Probably she didn't know herself. She passed by on her way out of London and called in to see if the girl would go for a run with her." "That's possible, of course, but we mustn't lose sight of the notion that she had an assignation there, knowing her friend was going to be out, and all that talk about the run was to put the others off the scent. She'd guess well enough that none of them would go with her." "Humph," said Roger, who was quite willing to lose sight of that notion, in which he did not believe for a moment. "By the way," he went on, as a memory occurred to him, "I've a shrewd idea that that fellow she was engaged to, what's his name? Pleading, has his suspicions. Did you notice him in the court this morning? Half a dozen times he seemed to me on the verge of saying something significant." "Yes, I thought he might have something in his mind. I was going to have a talk with him tomorrow morning." "It's a rotten position for him," Roger said thoughtfully, "and it'll be rottener still if he has got a suspicion that everything isn't as straightforward as it might be. To have one's fiancée commit suicide is bad enough, but to have her murdered—" "Look here, Moresby, why not hold up your talk with him for a day or two?" "Why, Mr. Sheringham?" "Well, it's rather a nice point. If he has got his suspicions, you see, would he let things stay as they are to save her family any further scandal, or would he do his damnedest to get at the truth? In my opinion, he'd want the truth, but he's not going to be quite sure at first what he wants. Well, if you descend on him before he's made up his mind, he might be driven into holding his tongue. A sort of counter-instinct, you know, and if he's got anything to tell us, that would be a pity. On the other hand, if you leave him till he's quite clear about it, I shouldn't be at all surprised if he doesn't come to you, and in that case you get far more out of him than in any other way. This is all on the assumption that he is suspicious, of course, which may not be the case at all." The chief inspector consumed a little more beer. "There's a good deal in that," he admitted, wiping his mouth delicately on a large blue silk handkerchief. "Yes, perhaps I was a little hasty, and that's the one thing we ought not to be. Very well, I'll give him 3 days and see if you're right. It'll be a feather in your cap if you are." Roger looked over the notes he had been taking of the conversation. "Well, what it seems to amount to," he said, "is that we've got to look for a man who touches our circle at various points, including Monte Carlo last February. He's probably a hefty fellow and a gentleman, or passing for one, and we can't necessarily expect anything abnormal in his mental makeup except on this one topic. If we narrow our search down to one man, I shall try to get him to talk on that topic, which won't be too easy to introduce, by the way, and if he gives himself away, we can be pretty certain we're on the right track. And then we've got to prove it against him," added the chief inspector with gloom, "and that's going to be the most difficult job of the lot. if you'd been at the yard as long as I have, Mr. Sheringham, you'd know that— Hello? Isn't that your telephone?" Roger rose and went to the instrument in his study adjoining. In a moment he was back. "For you, Moresby," he said. "Scotland Yard." Moresby went out of the room. When he returned a few minutes later, his face bore an expression of rather reluctant admiration. "That was a smart bit of psychological deduction you put in only a few minutes ago, Mr. Sheringham," he said. "What do you mean?" Roger asked, agog. The chief inspector stooped and plucked out a feather which was protruding from the cushion in his chair. "Here you are, sir," he said. "Put it in your cap. Mr. Plaidle's waiting at the yard to see me at this minute. Care to come round too?" "You bet I would," said Roger with fervor. End of chapter 7.